Great. Good afternoon. My name is Gaurav Kupa, and I have the great honor of moderating this panel today, and it's titled Saving Our Planet, Energy, Climate, and AI. We have an impressive group of panelists from academia and industry with perspectives ranging from computer science to public policy. Each of the panelists work in related fields to climate change mitigation. And the goals of the panel are twofold. One is to raise awareness for climate change, and two is to inspire students to contribute to climate change solutions. The structure of the panel will be split into the 2 hours. First, each of the panelists will give a talk about the work that they do and how students can contribute. And then the second hour will consist of Q&A questions from the audience to incite meaningful discussion with the panelists. If you'd like to get involved, you can join the Slack channel for the ML at SJSU club. I will put this into the chat. I'll put this into the chat. There we will be posting the any resources for educational purposes, as well as the slides presented today. And furthermore, I think that will be important to build a community and start working towards solutions towards this problem, especially from an interdisciplinary purpose. So with that, without further ado, I will introduce our first panelist, Christopher Anderson. Christopher is the co-founder and CTO of Salo Sciences, and he leads the visual and design team there. He is also pursuing his Ph.D. in biology at the Center for Conservation Biology at Stanford University. Go ahead, Christopher.
Great. Thank you so much, Gaurav. Thank you so much for the introduction. Can I just double check that everyone can hear me and I'm presenting all right?
Yep, everything's great.
Super. So yeah, as mentioned, my name is Christopher Anderson. During the day, I'm a PhD student at Stanford University. And during the nighttime, I'm the co-founder and CTO at Salo Sciences. And at Salo, we are a conservation technology company. Our mission is to accelerate solutions to climate change and biodiversity loss by guiding investments in natural climate solutions, which include conservation, restoration, and improved land stewardship. My co-founder Dave and I are both ecologists by training, and we're also experts in airborne and satellite remote sensing. And so I'm here today to introduce our AI-based forest monitoring system, the California Forest Observatory, which was just built and launched in September this year. And so the Forest Observatory is a new forest monitoring system that we designed to map the drivers of wildfire behavior. These are the vegetation fuels, weather, and topography that drive fire movement across landscapes, all from space. It was built in partnership by Salo Sciences, Planet, the satellite manufacturer, and Vibrant Planet, a communications group. It is generously funded by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, with additional support from the California Tahoe Conservancy, the Sierra Nevada Conservancy, and the Tahoe Fund. And before we really get into the system, I'll just give a bit of a background on the state of wildfire in California. The state has really increased a dramatic increase in fire frequency and intensity over the last 50 years, culminating in a decade of really catastrophic wildfires. Over 20,000 fires have been recorded since 2010, following over 300,000 recorded ignitions during that period. And even though this year's largest fire complexes were the result of these dry lightning storms, the majority of wildfires across the state have been started by people. Over 80% of ignitions occur near roadsides or near utilities infrastructure. And we're now exposed to larger and more frequent wildfires as the wildland urban interface has grown and housed more and more people. This is in part due to a growing population. California is home to nearly 40 million people now, which is twice the population from 1970. And to support all this growth, the road and utilities networks have expanded, fragmenting the state's ecosystems and increasing the reach of potential human-caused ignitions. But despite the thousands of ignitions that occur each year, over 95% of our fires are actually suppressed by first responders. But still somehow the largest fires keep getting larger. Why is it that the fires that get out of control become so catastrophic? And it's really because the largest fires tend to emerge during hot, dry, and fast wind conditions. The notorious Camp Fire, which devastated the community of Paradise, started during sustained wind speeds of 25 to 30 miles an hour, with gusts recorded over 45 miles an hour. And dry weather is a dominant driver of fire behavior. It's really why we have like a fire season after all, but it's definitely not the only one. These dry winds are blowing through long-term desiccated and drought-stressed ecosystems. As white Americans settled and suppressed wildfires in our fire-adapted landscape here, trees grew relatively undisturbed. And in the past 90 years, tree density has increased by over 30% in forests, while the average tree diameter actually decreased by 20% over that same time period. And so this transition from like a few large resilient trees into many small trees with low biomass has altered a few really key ecological dynamics. Really densely packed trees use lots of water, they exacerbate drought stress, and they often act as ladder fuels that carry surface fires up into the canopy. And the legacy of fire suppression suppressed the natural cycle of fire, leading to the growth of dense, fuel-packed forests, which has been further stressed by a decade of drought. And that decade of drought led to the death of over 100 million trees, mostly focused in the Sierra Nevada, where the catastrophic Creek Fire occurred. And so, as these hot and dry conditions are expected to persist longer under climate change, it seems like the opportunities that we have to actually manage forests to reduce risk are dwindling. And the big question that we want to help answer is, can we restore the past cycle of fire to the system? Today, the majority of financial resources are spent responding to fires. And our firefighters and our first responders are really highly trained and skilled, putting out over 95% of all fires, like I mentioned. But as these fires grow larger and more intense, this model of resource allocations becomes less and less sustainable. I'll talk about it more in a second, but there's really emerging consensus among fire scientists, indigenous communities, and conservation groups that we as a state need to help flip this paradigm and start investing heavily in active forest management, including cultural and prescribed fires. To help animate sort of this abstract pie chart into reality, here's a map showing the extent of all planned fires deployed across the state, as well as a map of the unplanned fire extents. You can see there's a big shift in where these fires occur and in their size. This doesn't even include this year's fire season. And there's also a really big difference in these two fire types between the human health impacts of each type of fire, with really large wildfires that get burned out of control, leading to disproportionately high respiratory illness rates. And unfortunately, the pie itself is shrinking. As each year, more and more resources are spent on wildfire response, which was historically done at the expense of active fire management. The 2017-2018 fire season, before this year, the worst on record, received over 10 times the amount of funding as the 2010 fire season. And with climate change, this really isn't about to slow down. This year, and we're just now coming to hopefully the tail end of the fire season as cold weather comes into the state. It's been the biggest fire season on record as far as area burned, burning past the 2018 fire season in only just 1 month of the fire season. So we want to figure out how we can use technology to help address this problem. And we set out to design a new conservation technology system that could help flip this response resilience paradigm that would help identify priority management areas, monitor change over time, and better predict wildfire behavior. To do this, we interviewed over 70 experts in wildfire science and forest management to get a sense for some of the pain points, the data gaps, and the opportunities for the next generations of technology to help better serve the fire community. And we really built the Forest Observatory to fill a major gap that we heard about over and over again, to provide access to current and high-resolution information on the state of vegetation fuels that drive wildfire across California. Overall, after talking to everyone, we learned that there's over 100 different organizations across California that are responsible for mapping and responding to wildfire risk. And each have their own workflows that they utilize, their own software systems, their own modeling tools, their own assumptions and workflows, but they all actually use the same vegetation fuels data set. These data are generated by Landfire, which is a program run by the US Forest Service and the US Geological Survey. And while they provide free and comprehensive data across the United States, which are updated every few years, it's often out of date by the time they're produced, and they're also only available at really coarse resolution. We'll get into Landfire in a bit more detail shortly, but we built the observatory to map these ecological patterns in unprecedented detail in a system of 3 components. First, vegetation fuels mapping and monitoring data, which is a cloud-based system to process massive volumes of airborne and satellite data. Second, The Forest Observatory is a data visualization platform, providing people with a simple and intuitive view of the drivers of fire behavior. You shouldn't need to be an expert in geospatial analysis to access and understand these data. And finally, an API or tool set to be able to connect some of these different software systems. We also integrate a series of external data feeds, including weather forecast data and hazard forecasts, fire perimeter data, and we're about to produce a new updated map of wildfire exposure across the state. And these should provide a deeper context into the patterns of fire behavior across the state. All of the data from the Forest Observatory are free and open for non-commercial use by scientists, government agencies, and nonprofits. And our goal is to produce the data so that they become the new standard for wildfire research and for modeling efforts. And we generate these data in a stepwise process. First, there's a system called airborne LiDAR, which maps the drivers, or like vegetation structure at really high resolution using an airborne platform sensor. You have an airplane, cut a hole in it, you stick a laser at the bottom, and it scans the forest. These data are great for providing a really precise estimate of the structure of a forest, but they're often available only in the areas where they've done these airborne surveys. To be able to scale them out across a large area would be sort of infeasible and impractical. Fortunately, we have access to satellite imagery, which is available on a regular basis over really large areas, but you tend to have these different units, how much light is absorbed and reflected, your radar backscatter coefficients. Even though satellite data are sensitive to the patterns of the vegetation fuels, actually quantitatively assessing them in the imagery is really difficult. So what we ended up doing was taking a deep learning approach, using image-based analysis to train 2D convolutional neural networks, which are pattern recognition algorithms, to use the airborne LiDAR data as sort of our ground truth, our labeled imagery, the satellite data as our features, our response variable. And then we trained the deep learning algorithms to use the 2D patterns in imagery to be able to apply the deep learning model to the whole state's worth of data and apply it to satellite imagery over time to generate regularly updated maps of these vegetation fuels. These include metrics of tree height, how tall the trees are, horizontal tree cover, which is an estimate for both wildlife habitat and for how fire moves across the landscape, base height, which predicts whether a fire will move from ground into a canopy fire, bulk density, or the density of combustible fuel within a canopy, as well as some of the underlying surface fuels, which predict how fire spreads across the landscape. These are available across 5 years from 2016 to 2020. And for those bookending years, we have imagery from Planet, meaning the data are available at 3-meter spatial resolution, which is the highest resolution that's currently available. I want to be quick because I want to respect everyone else's time here, but the data from the Forest Observatory to compare to land fire is about 100 times the resolution at the 3-meter data compared to the 30-meter data because of the 10 by 10 resolution. It's updated on a yearly basis. So the fuel estimates that we generated this year in 2020 are currently the highest resolution and the most up-to-date data on the state of vegetation fuels that preceded this catastrophic wildfire season, as opposed to land fire, which was, even though it was updated in 2020, the data itself actually mapped onto patterns close to 2014, 2016 in the imagery. And we're using a strictly data-driven process. This is just based on the pattern recognition that we're doing in the satellite imagery and deploying it, as opposed to land fire's process where they actually manually review all the data across the country in a consensus approach, which is valuable in its own way for a lot of its own reasons. But we're able to generate these estimates at higher resolution on a much faster timescale by taking a data-driven approach. Our model performance is pretty strong in this case, using the airborne LiDAR as our baseline standard for comparison. We see really tight relationships using spatially independent holdout data, finding the best predictions for canopy cover and canopy height, our worst predictions for canopy base height, which is like the space between the ground and the lowest level of canopy fuels. And I think it's probably because it's easier to evaluate how much space a canopy occupies relative to, or instead of the space that the negative space below a canopy, but I won't get into too much detail on that. And then the web platform that we built was a way to generate these data, make them visible, and make them accessible to the whole broader community. You can access data through the API, through the web platform, Everything's available through forestobservatory.com. In the left-hand panel, where you can visualize these different high-resolution data sets, you can monitor daily weather trends, you can download data and explore the patterns of change. You can click on the little info buttons to scan between years. You can use the opacity slider to scan between different layers. You can also share your current views from the lower right. You can search and zoom to different regions, as well as open up a menu of different options for understanding some of the terms of use and creating an account. And so regarding data access, I wanted to remind everyone that the Forest Observatory data are free for non-commercial use. It's open for governments, nonprofits, researchers, academics, and the general public. And yeah, just to make sure everyone has enough time, I think I'll say, we're really excited about the new advances in technology through access to satellite imagery, to deep learning, and to these new approaches where we can actually derive new insights from this high resolution information to help better predict some of these patterns of fire behavior, to understand which areas are at higher risk and forecast where we need to be making mitigations across the landscape to reduce risk to our communities in general. So I think I'll stop from there just to be sure that I'm giving everyone else enough time, but I'm happy to follow up more.
Thank you, Christopher. And I think it's great that the data set is open publicly for non-commercial use. I think that would enable a lot of students to do projects and gain more insight using the data. Thank you, Christopher.
Yep.
Next up, James Peverill. James is the CEO of GreenSight Agronomics, the developer of GreenSight, a data platform that uses automated drones to gather daily imagery and deliver actionable information to customers.
Yeah, thank you so much. Here, I'm going to, I think if I, oh, there we go. Share my screen here. Great. Yeah. So I kind of wanted to, I know this is a climate change panel. I wanted to talk a little bit about our entrepreneurial journey in building what we wanted to do as an impact business, and kind of talk a little bit about the challenges we had doing that. Just a quick summary of GreenSight. We are, I consider us to be a leader in agricultural drone technology. We have about 30 employees. We're primarily based in Boston, Massachusetts. The company was started in the beginning of 2015. It was actually December of 2014 if you count the legal paperwork, but we basically started in 2015. And we've built what we consider to be an all-inclusive, unattended drone scouting system for agriculture. And the company's objectives really is to make agriculture more efficient with data, to deploy automated robots at scale, and ultimately, hopefully, save the world, because someone has to. A little bit about myself and my co-founder, Joel. We worked together in aerospace for quite a long time. Joel actually hired me out of school in 2003, so we've known each other a long time, and we spent, almost over 10 years working in aerospace on a variety of different projects and small satellites, and in particular working on drone technology. Most of the work that I did in particular was doing military R&D. Which was great. And we did a lot of really interesting projects, visited a lot of military bases in other countries, including Afghanistan. I have a picture there from when we deployed a system we built to Afghanistan. Joel and I really wanted to take the technology that we were building and do something with a little more general impact. Building military products is great, but ultimately it doesn't reach the common person much, and it doesn't have a huge impact that we thought the potential of the technology had. So the vision of the company that we started was really to try to revolutionize industries using data, AI, and robotics. And we had a pretty ambitious plan to build a full stack system to do that. We've been at this for 5 years. We've fundraised about $3.7 million, in addition to a lot of corporate money we've used. In total, spent over $4 million building our technology. We've conducted over 9,000 flights worldwide now, which is, I think, pretty good in terms of drone company operational experience. We have a unique hardware platform that one of the great things about it is a very long flight time. We've managed to build a system that exceeds the capabilities of a lot of the, I guess, big consumer companies like DJI. It's probably the largest drone company in the world. And we've proven that we can save input costs in agriculture, water reduction, chemical reductions, labor savings. I mean, we really kind of established that at this point, which took a while. Um, our product is really full stack, and this was the vision of the company when we started, which was extremely ambitious in a lot of ways. We build our own custom hardware. We actually manufacture drones. We built our own sensors. We developed our own image processing pipeline. It uses machine learning to classify diseases and do useful analytics for customers. And then we've built a whole customer solution behind that to do flight and data management, so we can actually remotely manage the drone flights, and then present all the data to customers through a web-based platform. And the vision here was that really by creating the entire stack of the technology, we could give the best customer experience, especially for business customers where, selling a drone to a business customer, they say, well, what am I going to do with this? They need something else to use it. Really, we really wanted to deliver them data on a subscription basis and give them everything they needed to gather that data. And we had to build a pretty impressive engineering team to do this, and it took a little while to get where we are now. We started the company really wanting to get into agriculture. We thought this was one of a really significant impact business. It's actually is the largest industry in the world, no doubt, and it employs the most number of people in the world, and has a significant impact on climate change and resource usage. It's an area where we really need to increase productivity. There's actually a great Goldman Sachs paper that I linked from these slides that I would recommend anyone read who's interested in agricultural technology. They really break it down very clearly that humanity needs about a 70% increase in agricultural food production productivity by 2050 just to feed everyone, which is not too far away, and it has significant impacts all across the board. And according to their projections, precision agriculture, so precision fertilizer application, water, chemical usage, and planting, is going to make up about 75% of that required increase in productivity. There's some other technologies in there too, but really there's not a lot of extra labor out there that we're going to be able to apply to agriculture. There's not a lot of extra land. And a lot of the technologies we've used in the past to expand production, like genomics and seed variety improvements, are kind of tapped out. From here on out, a lot of it is going to be precision agriculture. And this was kind of one of the inspirations for why we wanted to get into agriculture. We felt like there was a need for data to optimize this industry. One of the challenges we had, though, and it's kind of one of the challenges I wanted to talk about for the rest of this presentation, is fundraising. We started this business with really ambitious technology goals. We knew we were going to need a significant amount of capital to develop the technology, and I think this is a problem that a lot of people have. We wanted to start an impact business, and how do we finance it? And one of the things you find when you pitch impact businesses to investors is there's a lot of investors out there who want to invest in impact businesses. They pitch themselves as impact investors. But if you talk to them, you find that impact is only part of it. You really need to be pitching a business that does have significant growth potential, and it does have good fundamentals. It's not enough to have impact. You have to have a business behind that for investors to get behind it. We came up with a strategy, which I will tell you that anyone who's interested in entrepreneurship, every entrepreneurial journey is very different, and ours is no different that way. Every journey is unique. How you get there. We came up with a strategy to focus on golf courses initially. Even though we wanted to get into agriculture, when we did a lot of market research, we found that a lot of the agricultural customers that we wanted to target probably weren't ready to buy the technology. They were interested in it. They were interested in using it. They would use it if we gave it to them for free, but in many cases, they weren't really willing to pay for it. So it's kind of hard to validate a market where customers aren't willing to pay yet. So we came up with this strategy to target golf courses first. It is an agricultural industry. I wouldn't call it the biggest impact industry. It's kind of it's like a kind of a bougie form of agriculture, honestly. But they were willing to buy the technology, and it kind of vetted us as having a business that we could then use to pitch investors, even while we had this vision of getting later into agriculture. And it's a strategy that did work for us. We managed to raise close to $4 million to build our technology. based on this kind of strategy of going into a really high-end market first and then diversifying. And now we're starting to service vineyards. We're starting to do work in forestry and um, um, other types of high-end agriculture, and kind of moving our way down the chain. So we kind of started high, and now we're moving down into other forms of agriculture. And that was kind of a strategy we came up with. Other types of impact businesses, I would encourage you to maybe come up with kind of a similar strategy. You got to figure out how to form a pitch a business that really has good fundamentals behind it. So I had a couple of learnings here I wanted to talk about behind that. As you're thinking about your impact business, I'd encourage you to brainstorm and think about the fundamentals behind that business in parallel with the level of impact. Because if you don't have a good business fundamentals behind the business, and you don't have a growth story behind it, it's really hard to get investors behind it, even though they might advertise themselves as impact investors. The other thing is that customers have a lot of inertia, and a lot of times, if you go into a customer that's been in business for a long time, like agriculture, even if you have a way or a technology that might maybe make their business more efficient, it can be difficult to get them to convince them to use it. Just like anybody else, businesses like technologies and products that increase their convenience and also have an impact on their business. So think about the customer from the perspective of a person. Are you increasing their convenience factor? Are you making their life easier? Are you making their job easier? Because if you're in a situation where you're selling and convincing a customer to use your product, that does come into play. Economics are great, impact is great, efficiency is great, but ultimately, personal convenience is a really great way to convince people to use your product. And that feeds into the third thing, is that savings and efficiency are really great. You can go into a business, you can say, all you need is our products. You're going to be 60% more efficient. You're going to make all this extra money. It can be a great pitch, but businesses are always reluctant to spend money, even if it means they're going to save more. Even if you have ironclad data that shows they're going to save more, it can be difficult because it's extra effort, it's capital up front. It's difficult to kind of move them off that inertia. Typically, there's sort of a general rule of thumb. Even a business that's really, really kind of economics based, you need to really be able to convince them absolutely that they're going to save about at least 3 times as much as your product costs to really get them engaged. And ideally, it's even more, like 10 times. And it can be a really difficult egg and kind of chicken and egg problem where you have a new product, a new idea. You haven't really vetted the fact that you can save this information, save this amount of money or efficiency. So you kind of have to figure out how to prove that you can save that amount through data in order to get the customers you need to prove that you have a business. So it's a challenging situation. The other thing is one of the things that we did, which was successful, is to think about a business that has vertical integration to really jump over stale business models. In our case, we figured if we made a drone, who are we going to use for data processing? There's all these businesses that are focused on data. We have a drone, we're kind of only part of the solution. We really figured if we provided a full solution, we could kind of jump over that entire business model. There's currently a whole ecosystem of suppliers that provide different pieces, but they don't provide the full solution. So we kind of came in and decided we're going to try to jump that entire chain. We're going to provide a subscription product that gets the customers the data that they want. And that was kind of one of the things that we did that I think was encourage you to think about businesses that have vertical integration, so you can really jump over existing businesses and kind of cut it all out. That can be ambitious from a development standpoint, but it is elegant, I think, especially when you talk to customers about it. So kind of closing out, personally, I'm a pretty positive person in general. I truly believe that more efficient and lower resource technologies and approaches eventually win, but it can be a challenge, a frustrating challenge if you're kind of on the ground and down in the weeds trying to push that. But I'd encourage you to keep pushing on it. Actually, I consider that solar energy to be one of the sort of win stories that I kind of find inspiring. Ultimately, getting energy from the sun is simply good business. Even if you're the most, I don't know, ecologically damaging person out there, ultimately it's much more expensive and much more difficult to dig your energy out of the earth and use non-renewable sources than it is to gather it from the sun. And in the end, that technology is really proving itself out. That model is really proving itself. And I've been inspired for the last decade, really, of the direction that's going. And I think there's a lot of other areas where similarly, we're going to see the same thing. Ultimately, being more efficient and using less resources is better business, smarter business. It's going to take a lot of smart and ambitious people to make this happen across the, across the spectrum of the industries. And I encourage you guys to keep trying to do it. So I'm happy to chat with anyone about this type of thing. I get really, really passionate about entrepreneurship, and I recognize that starting companies and being ambitious and trying to build visions like this is really hard. So if you want to reach out to me, feel free to do so. My email's here. Don't get discouraged if I don't answer right away, but I do ultimately answer almost every email I get. But like all you guys, I do get a lot of email, but feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you, James. I think you make tremendous points, especially if we want to approach zero carbon emissions by the end of the century. We need profitable businesses and profitable business models.
Absolutely, yeah.
Making
I
impact.
believe they're out there, though. I believe they're out there. So you guys have to build them.
Definitely, yes. Next, I'll be introducing Dr. June Flora and Dr. Chad Zanako. Dr. Flora is a senior research scientist at Stanford University Human Sciences and Technology Advanced Research Institute. Her research focuses on understanding the drivers of human behavior change and the potential for communication interventions. Dr. Zanako is a postdoctoral researcher at Stanford, working with Dr. Flora. Prior to his postdoc, he completed his PhD in public policy at Oregon State University and has a master's degree from UC Davis.
Yeah, so good afternoon, everybody. As I was introduced, I'm actually a postdoc in civil and environmental engineering, but I myself am not an engineer. I'm a social scientist along with Dr. Flora. And, a lot of my research has been kind of taking public opinion research and trying to better understand people's opinions, perspectives, motivations around climate change and energy use. Okay, so I'm going to introduce you to two topics I've been working on that I think will be of interest to this group. So, my reason for talking about both of these topics is I want to give you some ideas about the range of social science research that intersects with climate change. I'm also hoping that, you will challenge yourselves to think about new approaches to addressing climate change and, most importantly, develop interesting questions that can lead to interesting insights. And so the first topic I'll be discussing involves new energy development. What are the things that drive support for energy development? How does proximity to development influence how people think about this development? And so for this talk, I'll be discussing new energy development involving unconventional oil and gas development, also known as fracking or hydraulic fracturing. And so the next topic I'll be discussing is how climate change mitigation policy support is shaped among the general public. And I'll be talking about how experience with extreme weather events can shape climate perspectives. And so, many of you are probably have faced some extreme weather if you're based in California and probably, elsewhere throughout the country, and maybe especially so in California in the last couple of months. Okay, so let's first talk about new energy development. So, one of the tools that social science researchers have at their disposal is public opinion polls or surveys. So you guys have all been hearing a lot about polls in the news, and with this recent election, in many ways, I guess you're seeing how the science around public opinion polling is not settled. There's been a lot of research surveying people and asking them about their support or opposition to the the practice of fracking. So fracking is a process, that is used to extract both oil and gas from shale rock, usually deep beneath the Earth's surface. And, it's associated with these potentially, negative environmental impacts, such as things like groundwater pollution, methane emissions, noise disturbances, and even sometimes earthquakes. And so whether or not someone supports fracking can be associated with things like demographics, like, age, income, gender. In general, people who are older, male, conservative Republican are more likely to support fracking. But, this support is pretty complex. And so the main question around fracking and the kind of this abundance of natural gas that it produces is whether it presents a positive or negative climate impact. So people who think it is better for the climate say that it is cleaner than coal and can serve as a bridge to clean renewable energy. And people think that it's bad for the environment, think that it is a cheaper form of carbon energy. And this will make the transition to renewables much more challenging, and you'll be producing a lot of greenhouse gas emissions in the process. So I'll be discussing this in the next few slides. And so you remember how I said in that last slide how it's pretty complex, this idea of fracking support. Well, we found this relationship that we think is pretty important, and that is actually how close someone lives to a fracked well, or like their proximity to the well, like via Euclidean distance. So kind of birds, crow fly kind of distance. And so after controlling for demographic characteristics, using a regression modeling, a statistical modeling approach, we find that people who live closer to fracked wells are on average more supportive. And so, what could be some explanations for this? Well, there's like this explanation that, maybe, they live in a community, or they themselves are kind of reaping some economic benefits from, these fracked resources. It could be that people who are really opposed to fracking don't want to live near it, so they move away. And people that, are supportive of it move towards it. And so, although we can show these patterns, oftentimes the explanation for why they exist can be challenging. And I think another thing that's important here is that, I'm showing a figure over in the left here showing, 2012 to 2016 and, support opposition. You can see that while there does appear to be some change in public opinion across time, it's not really going in one direction or another, right? And so, as a result of fracking, and you guys have probably been reading about this, we have a lot more natural gas in the US. We have so much natural gas that we can liquefy it and then export it to other countries. And so there's actually been a steady increase in public support for exporting natural gas to other countries. And this is even true among people who identify as environmentalists. So, this may suggest that, maybe natural gas is being bridged more of, is being viewed more as like this bridge fuel. But, again, like the kind of, we can't really parse out exactly the behavioral or the cognitive reasons why people may be in more agreement or more support of something like LNG. So the next topic I'm going to discuss is public support for climate change mitigation policy. So, similar to fracking support, there are certain demographic characteristics that are related to climate policy support. Democrats and liberals are typically, more supportive, as well as those who are younger. However, what we're interested in is, the sort of things that may change people's opinions and actions towards climate policy. And so to do this, we examined experienced extreme weather events. And extreme weather events themselves have become more frequent and more severe due to human-caused climate change. And so in our research, we selected 10 extreme events across the US and surveyed residents in counties where they experienced these events. So we asked survey questions about, personal characteristics of people, including, were they harmed by the extreme event, personally harmed? And, what was their level of support for climate change mitigation policy? So here are some figures showing just some averages from this for each one of the cases that we explored. And you can see that, there are cases with more personal harm associated with them. And there are some cases with, more mitigation policy index. This is higher score there. And there's a range of extreme events that we considered, including, flood, tornado, wildfire, hurricane, even one that was not really that related to climate change, which would be a landslide, right? And so using statistical modeling and controlling for demographics and other characteristics, we find an effect where people who report experiencing more personal harm from extreme weather are actually more likely to support climate mitigation policy. And this effect is particularly strong for conservatives. And conservatives have kind of this lower, this baseline level of support. And as they report, experiencing more personal harm, their support for climate change mitigation policy has this upward trend there. So how do we connect this all back to climate action? Well, I guess the first thing I would argue is we already kind of know a lot about what sort of low carbon policies we should be pursuing, but we're not doing them, at least in the U.S. So why are we not seeing more climate action? And second, apart from government policy, what sort of personal actions will individuals take on their own? And so I would argue that one reason why we're not seeing this strong government support for climate change policy, at least in the U.S., is that there's really not this this overwhelming call to action by U.S. citizens. There are a lot of people who think that climate change is happening and want to do something about it, but perhaps the totality of the U.S. public is not really willing to enact policies and take actions and make potential trade-offs about those particular policies. And second thing is I think motivating people to take personal climate action, maybe based on the kind of things they buy or how they travel, et cetera, is difficult because there's really no one size fits all solutions. People are complicated, they have complex motivations, and the interventions that may encourage certain personal climate choices among some people may not work for other groups of people. So in closing, I think there are a lot of interesting questions that you can generate through the study of public opinion. And social science researchers like myself and Dr. Flora, we need help, right? We're always looking for ways to tease apart cause and effects of policies and events. Understanding effects of policies and interventions on groups of people. How to take insights and bring them to scale. And and a big part of this is also thinking about who are the potential winners and losers of policies and interventions. So I think there are a lot of exciting forms of data and approaches that we can help apply to these types of questions. From public opinion polling to maybe looking at social media or news reporting to we already saw a presentation about geographic information, remote sensing, how that can be leveraged as well as health and kind of well-being data. And so I challenge all of you to work with others and yourself kind of think of some kind of interesting question and use data and approaches from data science and AI to answer it, and then not only answer it but come up with a plan on how to act with it. And so at least from a social science perspective, when you're doing this, I'd really like you to remember that if you're addressing human caused climate change, it's going to require some understanding of humans to be able to do that effectively, I would argue. And so, yeah, that's my talk. And yeah, thanks for your time, everybody.
Thank you very much, Chad. And I think you wrapped it up very well in that last statement that human action factors into the solution of climate change or the multiple solutions for climate change. Thank you. Next, we have Michael Gerda. Michael is a senior firmware engineer at Tesla, working to accelerate the world's transition to sustainable energy. His work primarily focuses on creating innovative battery storage and energy products, such as Megapack, PowerPack, Powerwall, and more.
Hey everyone, can everyone hear me all right?
Yes, loud and clear.
Awesome. Thank you, Gaurav, for the introduction. Yeah, like you said, so I'm Michael, and I'm hoping with this conversation to help get everyone motivated to try and accelerate the world's transition to sustainable energy. Oops, there we go. So one thing I wanted to start off with is just give you guys a general background about who I am and why I'm motivated about this. I think it's awesome that Christopher, James, and Chad all went before me, because I think my presentation is more of a summary about kind of what they all talked about. So Chris kind of gave us the data-driven side, where he went in and did the research, he did the qualitative analysis, he went in and he built tools to kind of help us discover the problem of what's happening in climate change. And then James kind of went in and talked about building a company to try and deliver solutions based on the problems that Christopher and others have identified. And then Chad kind of went in and talked about the data for people's perception around these solutions and the problems that we've identified. And so what I want to try and get out of this today for you guys is to like Gaurav said, I work at Tesla, and what I wanted to try and do is kind of share with you guys how it is from an industry perspective. So, given that we have problems, given that we have some solutions in place, what are companies doing today that kind of help accelerate like the mass adoption of these solutions and kind of get actually people on board to try and solve the problem? Because just having an identification of the problem, just having a solution to the problem isn't really enough. We need people to actually implement these and like adopt them. So why am I passionate about this? Like you said, so I'm a computer engineer from San Jose State University. I studied basically firmware engineering, computer engineering, and just general problem solving. So I'm very passionate about just solving problems in general. When I was younger, my parents always used to take us to Syria. I'm a Syrian American. And as soon as I got off the plane, I was always like, wow, you breathe different air, you smell different air as soon as you get off. I always thought it was very funny to me growing up, like my parents would take me to vacation in a third world country. Like who vacations in a third world country? That doesn't make any sense. But that's what I grew up with. And that motivated me. It motivated me to like, being in America and going to Syria, seeing the different, way we treat the environment, seeing how, over there you kind of can just throw things on the ground, you litter, we have smog, we have these problems, and people kind of just keep living their day-to-day life, and we're not doing anything about it. And I couldn't wait to come back to America where I could finally breathe some clean air, some fresh air, and see how different it is here versus there. And so, I think it really highlights just like that this is a global thing. This is something we all need to work on. And how are we going to do it? How are we going to go and try to actually meet the demand that we need for climate change? So next thing I'll talk about is just like the call to action. What would I want from the 100 or so people on this call right now, however many people are on this call? What do I want to get from this, from you guys at least? So we all know climate change is real. We all know it's one of the biggest, if not the biggest crisis we face today. And I don't want to sit here and, we're already kind of running out of time. I don't want to sit here and bore you guys with charts or talk about how CO2 is increasing and temperatures rising, or we know that forests are burning and ice glaciers are melting. And like I said, I'm from Chico, so that campfire that Chris was mentioning actually impacted my family directly. So we know those things are happening. We know those things are very real. But I want to take a kind of a different approach. I want us to go through and just like, what do we actually need to do? What are the solutions? What do we need to do? We need to transition away from coal, oil, and gas. We all know that. We need to transition to zero carbon transportation and improve public transport. We need to invest heavily in sustainable food, clean agriculture, and stop deforestation. And lastly, we need to change and enforce public policy and strengthen global commitments. And it's great because all three of them, the panelists before me, just talked about those things. So that's great. I don't have to highlight too much on this. But as an engineer, I learned that like the way to kind of really solve a problem is to first gather as much data about the problem, understand it, break it down, create actions, you need to execute and deliver on those, continue iterating on those, and just keep repeating that process until we get to the place we want to go. So knowing where we want to go and what we want to do, I think is the most important part of climate change. I can't pretend to tell you I know everything about global policy or why the Paris Agreement matters. Hopefully we go back into it now with our new leader, but anyways, I won't pretend to. Thanks, Joe. I won't pretend to tell you that I know everything about that. I'm not going to tell you I know everything about sustainable food or the deforestation like Christopher talked about. But what I can tell you is, as an engineer at a company that's trying to meet the demands that I think people are looking for, like the building solutions that people are looking for, I can tell you kind of what we go through from a product cycle perspective and how I think we need to continue breaking down this. So what I'll do is tell you a little bit about what we're doing today. So I actually have a pretty optimistic view about what's going on, and I think we're actually on the right path. I do think we're moving more slowly than I personally would like, so I think we need to accelerate further. And I think my CEO would agree. He tweets all the time about how we need to accelerate further and keep accelerating our mission. But if you look back at the first 2 points I mentioned, and in the previous slide, is like breaking down the problem and creating actionables. I think we've done an extremely good job with that. Christopher in his presentation really broke down like getting the data and the problems related to forests and fires and all of that. Chad was able to break down kind of the social policy perspective of it. We all know that like burning coal, oil, gas produces carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide, and it's bad for the environment. We know we have inefficient transportation methods right now. We know things like peaker plants and the way we distribute energy on our grid right now are extremely inefficient and not good for the environment. And luckily, we already have some solutions in place, like James talked about. We have solar and wind energy generation, which are huge. This is extremely awesome. This is a great thing. Like solar is a cheap way to produce energy, and it's good for the environment. This is awesome. We have electric vehicles. We don't have to rely on gas cars anymore, or going and getting foreign oil and all these different things. We have stationary storage, which can help offset peak demand and get rid of these peaker plants that are so bad for our environment. The biggest issues, though, are we have issues with high cost and low adoption. How do we get people to actually buy products that help us offset this impact that we're making to our environment? Not everyone can go out today and buy a Tesla, a solar roof, or a Powerwall. I can't even tell you how much a solar roof Powerwall costs when I work there, but I know I can tell you I can't afford it. So how do we do this? How do we make products that are better for people? How do we get people to actually want things that are making an impact to the environment, and get solutions that actually work for people? I think the number one thing is just right now cost-wide adoption. And how do we do that? How do we get more people to buy these things? We do it with data. So an awesome thing is that this is a AI machine learning kind of focused talk. We have a lot of really smart people on the call who are focused on this area, focused on AI, focused on data. And now what do we do with all that data? So we have solutions. We have the problem. We have a solution. Now what? Well, let's get as much data as we can about our solutions. And the more data we get about our solutions across the board, that involves public policy and everything, not just a Tesla or a Powerwall or whatever it might be. It's getting as much data as we can from trying these solutions out is where I think is the key to our improvements in this space. So one example that I wanted to give is the Megapack. This is like Gaurav was saying before, I work on industrial and residential energy storage systems and power delivery systems at Tesla. That includes Megapack, Powerwall, supercharger, etc. And basically anything that has a battery connected to it or can have a battery connected to it. And what do we do with these things? Well, we get data. So right now we have things like telemetry. So if you're some DIY person at home, you've probably built some embedded device or some IoT device. You've probably seen these things before, and that like getting data about it is extremely important to know how it's behaving. And we do this exact same thing in our products. I helped build the pipeline for actually getting as much data as we can about our products and how they're used, when they're being used, when are people needing energy, when are they not, what are the peak times on the grid, when are things a little better, where we can kind of charge at a cheaper rate, things like that. Getting as much data as we can about our products to help us not just improve the product for the customer, but also make the product cheaper for the customer, for future customers. So things like forecasting ahead of time to, things for electricity planning and scheduling around your EV. So one of the things that we did for the electric vehicle, for example, is we have our own chargers that connect to the car. And we know that charging your car at different times of the day can change its cost. So if you have PG&E, you can look at your bill and you can be on a different tier plan. And you can see that between usually 3 and 9 p.m. or 3 to 7 p.m., depending on your plans, you're going to pay around 40 cents per kilowatt hour. But if you start charging your car, say at midnight or 1 a.m., when not many people have their ACs running, not many people are running their washing machines, not many people are doing these different things that are intensive to the grid, it's cheaper. It's like 9 cents per kilowatt hour. So you can reduce your cost, by a pretty significant margin just by doing something at a different time of the day. And And so what we gathered is a bunch of data on when are people charging, when are people coming home, when are people doing these different things. And we then build solutions on top of that for customers without them even knowing in the background. They don't they just have a better product over time. They plug in their car and automatically now let's start charging at 1 so that when they wake up for work in the morning, their car is already charged and they paid a cheaper cost than before. So making it cheaper for people, making the widespread adoption a lot easier for people is kind of like the impact that we want to make going forward with data. So that's kind of like the driving motivation on how we can actually get people to have widespread mass adoption on all of our products, and not just our products, but all products. So there's many EV players in the game. I'm not going to tell you that Tesla is better than anybody else. You can decide for yourself. But what I will tell you is we need more people in this space. And the way we can get more people in this space is by making the solutions cheaper. Like competition is good in this. So there's other players in the game. Some cars are say 100,000, some cars are 40,000. These are still very, very expensive. So what we need to do is get more data about, hey, well, what do we really need in the car? What do people really need from a car? What do people really need from a power wall? What do people really need from energy in their homes? And then once we have all that data, we can go back and continue to iterate on the solutions we've already implemented, drive down the cost a little bit further, take more data, implement again, iterate, 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 and then you lower the cost of entry for people to come in, and you make it a no-brainer to purchase clean energy products. I think James mentioned earlier about solar panels and how great the technology is there. Solar panels started out as a very, very expensive product. With more research and development, we were able to bring the cost down. With more, more data about how people were using their solar panels and stuff at home, what energy we were getting from different locations, we were able to drive down the costs. One last example, I think I'm already kind of close to running out of time, but one last example I want to talk about with solar panels directly and how we were able to drive a better solution for customers is solar panels traditionally, the highest cost, the reason they're so expensive is because there's no one size fits all kind of solution. Solar panels are very custom to a person's house. You have to send somebody out there to inspect the roof. Once you get the dimensions of the roof, you have to now determine, hey, well, where's the best location? Then you find the best location on the roof, and then you try and size, the solar panels appropriately for that roof. Once you have the sizing, you then go and try and cut these down so that you can fit them perfectly onto their on the roof. And by the time you've gotten all there, you're already tens of thousands of dollars in on energy, and you might as well just stick with PG&E at that point. People don't want it anymore. It's complicated, it's expensive. And so what Tesla recently did is build a one-size-fits-all solution. The manufacturing of panels is extremely difficult, extremely expensive, and really digs into the cost. Well, why not build one single large panel that can just fit on every single person's roof? You manufacture one product that goes for every single person, and now you drive down that cost. And now we're able to have the lowest price per kilowatt hour for solar, and then for power walls, and et cetera, et cetera. So trying to go to the next slide. There we go. So to summarize, because I know I'm a little close to running out of time, what I want to talk about most is we know the problems that are coming with climate change, and we already have some identified solutions in place to help us transition away. What do we need to do now? It's that next piece is we need to execute in a way that allows mass adoption, because without mass adoption, we're not going to get anywhere. Making solar panels and building power walls and building all these things are great. But if nobody actually buys them, if nobody uses them, if we're not actually, getting ourselves towards a more sustainable future, then I think we're not, doing the right thing. And so lastly, I just want to finish with my favorite quote is just to accelerate the world's transition to sustainable energy. And I think we can do that with data, with good solutions, and really identifying the problem and continuing to iterate on these solutions. Thanks.
Thanks, Michael. I appreciate your engineering perspective towards this and kind of business-oriented perspective as well. I think it's very important to get clean technology products out to people's hands. Great. And the last speaker for the panel will be Priya Donti. Priya is the co-founder of Climate Change AI and a PhD student at Carnegie Mellon in computer science and public policy. Her work lies at the intersection of machine learning, electric power systems, and climate change mitigation.
All right, thanks, Gaurav. So hey, everyone, thanks for coming out to this panel. Yeah, so I guess a little bit about myself. I'm going to steal Christopher's line here. I'm a PhD student by day. and a co-founder by night. So during the day, I basically work on applications of machine learning to the power sector. And what I think a lot about is basically how do you incorporate power system physics into machine learning methods. I'm not going to talk about that today, but if that's something you're interested in, feel free to reach out to me afterwards. But then, as I mentioned, I'm also one of the co-founders of Climate Change AI, which is an initiative to facilitate impactful work at the intersection of climate change and machine learning by essentially building a community at this intersection, and also by kind of providing knowledge and resources, et cetera. So I'll get into that a bit later. Yeah, I think the order of the talks worked out well in the sense that, so Michael provided a little bit of an overview of climate change from the sort of what kinds of actions do we largely need to take in order to mitigate climate change. And I'm going to do a deep dive a little bit more into what are the ways in which AI and machine learning can actually contribute to each of those different horizontals. So yeah, I'm going to dive in, but apologies to Michael, I am going to give the obligatory climate change overview just super quickly. So as we all know, climate change is a really, really important issue with increasingly severe effects. Christopher talked about wildfires, for example. We're also seeing other kinds of storms and droughts and flooding. And importantly, the impacts of climate change are felt unevenly across the world. And in particular, the world's most disadvantaged populations are the ones who often feel the harshest effects of climate change, which is something I think we should keep in mind pretty centrally, sort of as we think about the ways in which we actually address this challenge. And one issue with climate change is that in some sense, it is not reversible. Once we experience some amount of climate change that has feedback effects like melting ice in the Arctic, which then as a result reflects back less sunlight and as a result accelerates the effects of climate change, and we can't sort of unmelt that ice once it is melted. So as a result, there's really an imperative to work on climate change mitigation really, really quickly. We need net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And even with a little blip due to COVID, emissions are still increasing year after year in general. So there's a lot of work to do here, and society needs to move quickly. And one issue, one kind of complication with climate change is that the problem is really distributed. The sources of emissions come from many different places. So this is a graph showing in 2016, emissions from the transportation sector, from electricity, from agriculture, et cetera. The slides are going to be shared after this. If you ever want to be that person who has a slick number off the top of your head, this is a good graph to look at. But in general, the point I want to make here is not the specific numbers, but that climate change is caused by many, many different sectors, which on one hand can be dizzying and disheartening. There's a lot to do, but on the other hand actually means that there are many different ways to have an impact in many different places that any individual can dive in to do something about this. So a lot of people ask me, is it too late to stop climate change? And one thing I want to emphasize is climate change is not an on-off switch. A lot of the things we've talked about today have been about climate change mitigation. So how do I actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions in order to reduce the extent to which climate change will occur? But we do already know that we are going to experience some of the effects of climate change. And so sort of another additional approach we can take is climate change adaptation. So building up resilience to the consequences of climate change. And so again, when thinking about climate change approaches, these are sort of two different routes of action to keep in mind. So a lot of the people in the audience here are coming from an AI and machine learning background. I do too. And I think it's often natural to sort of ask the question, given these skills that we have, given that we do know something about AI and machine learning and data, how exactly does this play into climate change? How do we actually do something about it, do something about climate change using these skills? I mean, we've seen a couple of good examples today, and I'm going to try to give a little bit of a broad overview of some additional ways and themes in which machine learning can plug in. So a lot of these examples are drawn from a paper that a bunch of us wrote called Tackling Climate Change with Machine Learning. And if you're interested in this area, I would encourage you to check either the paper out. It is a little bit of a behemoth, something like 60 pages, but check out the paper, or there are summaries of the paper available online, and I'll show you the website later. But really quickly, before diving into that overview, I do want to mention a little bit about climate change AI. So as I mentioned earlier, climate change AI is an initiative to catalyze impactful work at the intersection of climate change and machine learning. But importantly for people sitting in on the panel, there are basically a lot of ways that you can use the resources that we have to learn more about climate change and machine learning. Like I said, you can check out our paper, summaries of the paper. There are also tutorials on both climate change and machine learning available on the website. There are workshops, upcoming workshops, for example, in December, where you can meet other people working in this area, which is actually one of the points of action I'll talk about later, which is that meeting other people and finding collaborators is a really great way to sort of get plugged into these various into this area. We also have a newsletter and a discussion forum, again, aimed at sort of sharing job opportunities, resources, and also helping people discuss. So if, for example, if you have a question about a particular project at the intersection of climate change and machine learning, or you're looking to find collaborators, I would encourage you to, for example, post in the forum. So with that, I'm going to sort of dive a little bit into some of the aspects we talk about in this Tackling Climate Change with Machine Learning paper. So in the paper, we talk about ways in which machine learning can be used to address problems, for example, in the electricity sector by forecasting solar and wind power or helping us optimize grids in a more efficient manner. We also talk about ways in which we can help reduce emissions in buildings and cities and transportation, in agriculture, forestry, and land use, in industry. And we also talk about ways in which machine learning can plug in to helping us make better predictions about the climate. For example, make more actionable forecasts of climate and weather conditions that, for example, city planners can then act upon. And we more broadly talk about societal adaptation applications in biodiversity, for example, or in understanding disease spread, so forth. So again, there's a ton of information on this slide and I'm breezing past it really, really quickly. But if you want sort of a step-by-step breakdown of sort of, this is what you need to do in the electricity sector in order to reduce emissions, and this is what machine learning can do to plug into each of those things, I would again encourage you to check out the paper. But I'm going to slice and dice some of the conclusions of the paper in a slightly different way at the moment, which is to talk about some recurring themes, talk about various kinds of ways that machine learning often appears again and again across electricity systems, across land use, across climate prediction, to try to give you a sense of, what are the kinds of things that machine learning can actually do in this particular space. So one of them, potentially, obviously, for a lot of people who think about machine learning quite a bit, is forecasting. So a lot of climate change problems involve some kind of uncertainty where if you had a little more knowledge about the future, then you could possibly make a better decision. And so things like if you could forecast how much solar power is going to be produced on the power grid ahead of time, that helps you more efficiently balance the power grid and as a result deal with renewables more efficiently. If you can forecast extreme events, then you can have city planners, for example, plan disaster response efforts. You can also do things like forecast carbon prices in markets. So forecasting is kind of obvious one. I won't belabor it too much. Another one is data mining and generation. So for example, when a location experiences a natural disaster that is due to climate change, there are a lot of applications of machine learning that will, for example, mine Twitter to try to understand what the situation on the ground is like. There are also a lot of applications that will, for example, try to mine data to understand how people are using public transportation systems in order to help plan next generation transportation systems. And to sort of call back a theme that came up earlier today on Chad's side, a lot of people also use Twitter to understand how the general public perceives various aspects of climate change. It's sort of a kind of natural, database of a lot of people's opinions, and machine learning can sort of help aggregate insights from those broad streams of data. Remote sensing is sort of another theme that has come up today, so I won't go into it too much in detail, but basically you can use things like satellite imagery and aerial imagery to get things like maps of emissions around the world, to get infrastructure data, to pinpoint information about deforestation and so forth. Machine learning can also, so these kind of first few are very much about sort of taking large and raw streams of data that may not be immediately useful to us and turning them into insights that are actually potentially useful to us. There's sort of another class of approaches, which is basically trying to help us accelerate or make more efficient existing engineering models that we have, existing scientific models that we have that we use day to day in various climate change related areas, but that there's some issue with them that needs to be resolved. So one of these is, for example, climate models that try to predict future climate are super large and really intensive to run. which means that in general, a lot of the insights you get are over a really large area. You don't necessarily get insights that are really fine-grained, and as a result, an individual or a city or something can act on them. And similarly, a lot of power scheduling models that are used to actually make sure that our power grids are balanced are really large and computationally intensive. And this means that they're not really able to deal with large amounts of, for example, solar and wind power that vary from moment to moment. So there are actually a lot of applications of machine learning that try to accelerate these particular models, either by simplifying parts of them or by kind of learning. You can sort of view the inputs of one of these models as sort of the features of a machine learning model, and the outputs of one of these models as sort of the labels of a machine learning model, and you can train a machine learning model to approximate all or parts of it. So this is sort of one large theme as well. And similarly, there's a huge class of applications where when we try to create next generation batteries or next generation solar panels or nuclear fusion models, for example, there are various issues that we need to resolve. So for example, when we're thinking about creating next generation batteries or solar panels, we often have this sort of really large space of materials that we want to try to experiment on. So it's like, if this is a proposed material for a next generation solar panel, I wonder what would happen if I synthesize it in the lab. It now takes me months to synthesize it in the lab and to test it. I see what happens, and then based on that, can figure out what material should I try out next. And that process is really large and it is really slow. I think a kind of common aphorism is that Thomas Edison tried out like thousands of light bulb thousands of designs for the light bulb before settling on the final one. And when you do this kind of trial and error thing, it can take a really long time. So machine learning has often been used actually to sort of learn patterns in past sets of experiments. I tried this material out, this is the outcome. I tried this material out, this is the outcome. So to find patterns in these past sets of experiments in order to recommend which experiments next are likely to be the most fruitful. Optimizing systems. So we've talked about precision agriculture. There are also a lot of applications of optimizing heating and cooling systems. And then finally, there is this area of predictive maintenance, which is things like, as you transport natural gas from where it's extracted to where it's going to be used, the natural gas can leak from these pipelines, and kind of natural gas is the same thing as methane, which is a really, really potent greenhouse gas. This is really bad. And so machine learning has often been applied to, sensors on these pipelines, for example, to try to understand where there's going to be a leak, or using satellite imagery above the lines to understand if there's already a leak. And predictive maintenance is one of those things that is really wholly unsexy, but is actually something that is potentially useful in this case of methane leaks. And this is sort of a common theme where often when we look for machine learning applications to use in the context of climate change, we're often tempted to look for really flashy solutions, and often very impactful things are not necessarily that flashy. So it's something to keep in mind. Okay. So some important considerations to think about as you're thinking about how do I use machine learning in the context of climate change. So machine learning, super exciting. I mean, again, we wrote 60 pages on all the ways in which machine learning can be used. So there are definitely a lot of ways. But it's important to keep in mind that machine learning isn't a silver bullet. There are a lot of problems that it's not applicable to. So for instance, there are a lot of people who will come to me and say, hey, could I come up with climate policy by building a fancy reinforcement learning algorithm that just optimizes everything and comes up with the ways that climate policy should be made? And the answer is no. Climate policy involves making a lot of choices and a lot of value judgments, and machine learning is not necessarily going to solve climate policy. So it's really important to understand that there is a very specific kind of problem or set of problems that machine learning is applicable to. And while that set is large, it doesn't cover everything. Where machine learning is applicable, it's often only one part of the strategy. So this has come up a couple of times today, but when we use something like satellite imagery to get insights about a particular area, or we use machine learning to create a forecast, ultimately somebody has to use that, right? So I think Chad said act with it. And that's really important. Machine learning is really only going to be one piece of that overall strategy. Yeah. So, and again, and it may not be the most flashy part of that strategy, or it may not be the first part of that strategy. So for example, when we think about smart buildings, a lot of the people, when we think about decarbonizing buildings, the first thing that comes to a lot of people's minds is, can we come up with smart building controllers that control the heating and cooling, et cetera? And yes, but you should probably insulate the building first, sort of understanding where machine learning comes in this pipeline. When you sort of propose a technological solution to a particular problem, it's also really important to understand that that solution lies within a broader context. And it's really, really important to be hyper aware of what that context is, because otherwise it's actually sometimes really easy to do something that you think is going to be good for the climate, but actually ends up being counterproductive. So a couple of examples of this are things like, there isn't actually agreement as of now as to whether autonomous vehicles are going to be good or bad for the climate. On one hand, a lot of proposed autonomous vehicles are electric, and there's sort of an idea that, right, by moving to basically more electric vehicle usage, then you sort of reduce climate impacts, which is great. On the other hand, though, autonomous vehicles may make driving easier, and as a result cause us to drive more, and as a result increase emissions. And so if you think about the narrow technological solution, okay, machine learning can help us sort of create autonomous vehicles and increase the usage of electric vehicles. You might think, okay, this is clear cut. But when you sort of expand the horizon a little bit and you think about the broader context, it's possible the sign goes either way. And so the takeaways there are, when you're sort of evaluating what problem to work on, really think about how it affects, the things around it, how it interacts with the broader system. And then also think about, in cases where it's not clear, how you can create the solution in a way that actually incentivizes it to have better impact. So if you work on autonomous vehicles, for example, how can I also talk to regulators and policymakers and work with them to make sure that the solution is going to be developed in a way that is actually ultimately good for the climate? Similarly, lots of considerations about equity. Generally, AI and machine learning technologies tend to be more accessible to people with more knowledge and wealth and power. And as I sort of talked about at the beginning of the talk, climate change is going to have the largest effects on people who do not already have those things. So we really have to be extremely cognizant about, when we propose something like autonomous vehicle technologies or precision agriculture technologies and so forth, that you're going to sort of get a bias in terms of who has access to that, and thinking about how you then create AI and machine learning solutions that instead sort of empower those without power is going to be a really important piece of this picture. And as a result, because there's a lot to keep in mind here, there are a lot of considerations to think about. It's really important fundamentally for your work to be driven by collaborations with people who think differently than you do, by end users and affected communities who might be different people from your collaborators. For example, when we think about wildfires, we might think about collaborating with governments and fire departments, but ultimately we do need to think about, who the people are who are being affected by wildfires, and we also need to take their perspectives into account. So yeah, so machine learning, super, super exciting. Lots to think about. When you work in the climate change space, it is a huge responsibility in addition to being a huge opportunity. And I think both of those things together are definitely to be taken seriously. Okay, so last point. So what can you do? Having heard this sort of rambly, this is what machine learning can do, this is what you should think about, what concretely should you do potentially if you want to work in this area? So one of them is learn about the different ways in which you can get involved in climate action, AI and machine learning or not. Of course, you're at this panel, so you're already taking that step, which is great. And I know, for example, a lot of you are university students. So one kind of easy thing to do is to sort of take classes and disciplines that aren't necessarily your own. I was really lucky as an undergrad to be able to take classes in, environmental policy, or environmental analysis or electrical engineering, or sort of various kinds of classes that weren't necessarily just my computer science major. And I think having that broad perspective and taking advantage of ways to get that broad perspective when you can is a really low-hanging fruit kind of thing to do. So I definitely encourage you to do that. Also, I would encourage you to check out some of the resources at Climate Change AI. So I mentioned our newsletter earlier. I mentioned that we have tutorials on climate change and machine learning. We have an upcoming workshop in December that'll feature various talks and papers about work in this area. And we also have recordings from our past workshops. So I would definitely encourage you to check all of those things out. And yeah, I would encourage you to find ways to actively collaborate with others who have different perspectives. So again, a lot of us are at universities. So talking to researchers and students who are in other departments or other majors from yours to try to understand their perspectives, what they're thinking about with respect to climate change, and to put your heads together often can yield really fruitful directions. Another one is that, we all live, we're all within or many of us are within a university context, but all of us also live within the context of some city or broader community. And there are a lot of people there. There are a lot of, for example, community organizations and governments and grassroots organizations that hold regular meetings who are working on things like transportation and renewable energy and et cetera. I would encourage you to figure out where those are going on and go to a community meeting. A lot of them are going on via Zoom right now, so you can even stay in your bed and do that. But it's a really good way to get acquainted with the ways in which people are working on these various issues, and to sort of bring your tech hat in there to try to understand, are there ways in which my particular expertise can help? Sort of as you go into these collaborative spaces, I would encourage you to go in, listening first to what they say is needed. Be humble. I think it is very easy as somebody with a technological background to sort of walk into a room and be like, I know what technological solution is going to solve all of the problems you have. And the reality is that people are experts on their own narratives. So really, I think it's very important to really listen to what collaborators say is needed, to what the on the ground realities are, so before coming in swooping with a solution. And then finally, make sure that there is a path to deployment for the work that you do. I think especially if you're from a research background like I am, it's very easy to do something that is potentially impactful, publish a paper on it, and move on. And while it might be a really useful climate change related idea, the climate doesn't see those impacts if it stays in a paper. It only sees those impacts if you do something with it. And so as you're working on climate change problems, always keep the end goal in mind. Think about, how is this actually going to be deployed on the ground? Who do I need to be talking with to make sure that that's going to happen, or to make sure to inform the work in a way that somebody else could do that, and really keep that end goal in mind throughout. So that is it. Yeah, if you want to learn more about some of the various things I talked about today, I would encourage you to check out the resources at climatechange.ai. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Priya. I think you touched on a very reoccurring theme that machine learning is not a silver bullet, but I would also kind of expand that out and say that there is kind of no silver bullet to solving climate change. You have to approach the problem from several different perspectives, which is very exciting, but also shows the extent of the problem. Great. I think we'll move on to the question and answer portion of the panel. The first question is for all the panelists. The question is, how can students get involved with the larger community of stakeholders, which would include policymakers, business people, and researchers, to impact climate change solutions? Anyone can take the mic.
Gareth, can you say the question again? I was typing an answer in the Q&A and missed it.
Absolutely. Okay, so the question was, how can students get involved within the larger community of policymakers, business people, and researchers to impact climate change solutions?
I mean, I think it's maybe a bit of a simplistic answer from my perspective, but I think just the power of direct connecting, like directly reaching out to people who are involved in the problems that you'd like to solve, like actually is a fairly useful way to actually make a connection with someone who's working on something that you care about. We get cold emails every now and then from students who are working for looking for an internship project, or who are doing like a thesis and want to use some data on something. And even though I try to do what I can to sort of engage with the broader community, it's hard to find sort of who exactly is working within a space. And I've sort of been pleasantly surprised by the cold calls and the cold emails that we get. And I think most people are sort of enthusiastic about sharing their work. I know so many people in sort of the climate change and the AI community and the research community all really want to find those connections and all really want to connect with as many people as possible, but aren't always sure exactly who to connect with or how to do it. So the more that you're reaching out to people and the more that you're just taking a chance and engaging with them, it seems like that's usually a pretty good place to get started. I would imagine the answer generally varies sort of by community, but just the first conversation, is a really good way to start.
Great. Is there any other reactions to what Chris said or the question?
Yeah, I think that especially if you're an undergraduate, using your internships to explore a variety of things is a good way to do a deep dive. There are, for example, a number of government agencies that have summer internships or fellowships. You can, of course, work at a private company. You can do research. I would definitely say use those internships wisely. And then also, don't be afraid to email people. I did a fellowship after undergrad where I traveled for a year and interviewed people about sustainable energy, and I was astonished by the number of cold emails that I sent out that just got answered, and people were really willing to meet and talk. So I would definitely encourage you to use that option to sort of reach out to people from whom you think it would be really useful to learn or really useful to meet them, and just go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I was second that, you can always send an email and worst that'll happen is they won't reply. But, a lot of times, you may get somebody that shares interest with you, whether or not that's at the local government level or, at the research institution level, or even, some other type of agency or some other group in your community that's doing work that interests you around climate change.
And one thing I'll add to that is, while you should definitely reach out more than you think you should in some sense if you're nervous about it, also do your homework. I think there's, in some sense, the kind of email I definitely don't respond to is somebody's like, hi, you do work in climate change and AI, can we talk? And it's like they haven't done any research on what kind of thing do you want out of that interaction, what kind of question do you have for that person. And I think that homework can both increase your probability of a response, but also just increase the productivity of that interaction on both sides, and make sure sort of that you're not sort of spamming people and wasting time. So definitely do your homework before doing that outreach.
So if I could just add for a minute, those are all really good ideas, having been in this field for a long time. So I think, as we've said before, making the most of internship possibilities. And, a lot of universities have those, but there are a lot of nonprofit agencies that engage youth in all sorts of things. I work particularly with Alliance for Climate Education. So those are all good ways to both learn about it, but to get involved in spreading the word. I think I really want to reinforce the do your homework issue, because I get a lot of these emails, and the extent to which young people have done their homework, they know a bit about me and a bit of my work, so they know what they're getting themselves into is going to reinforce my inclination to engage further. The final thing would be to think about building things yourselves, just as we've done here today. One person or maybe a group of people, I'm not sure how it all came together, just put it together as a whole, an endeavor, a club, a startup, so put your ideas down and start moving forward with like-thinking people in your own right, as well as at the same time, making a network of friends. And so on campus, and particularly at Stanford, I'm sure at Carnegie Mellon, there are all these opportunities to go around and to engage in sort of networking with young people who've started startups and so on. So just take advantage of the environment that you have around you. And particularly as you're in a university, you won't be in a university forever. It won't always be that at your doorstep. So I'd say take advantage of what you have there. So anyway, and Priya, by the way, I know Zico, Coulter, and Ines.
I might also make a pitch to contribute to like open source software projects. If you are doing technical development on work, I know that there's a broad community of people who are out there, and it sort of serves two purposes. One, you often get a lot of sort of technical feedback on the work that you contribute, and it tends to make you a lot better at actually developing some of these systems that are out there. And it contributes to a broader portal of research and information that everyone can share and use. I really see this as such an important component, like this interconnected ecosystem of different people's efforts working together to build some of the solutions to fighting climate change. We use open source software all the time at Salo, and as a result, like we're so really happy to provide the open and free data back to the rest of the community. And so we can all build this stuff together and do a lot more work and build out a stronger community that way.
Great. Those are all great answers. The next question is to Priya, Chris, and Michael. Anyone else can chime in as well. There's a lot of research being done on modeling macro energy systems, in particular large energy systems. How can we apply these models to physical systems and actually put them into real production?
Yeah, I think Priya had a really great slide synthesizing some of the different potential or like the emergent properties of how AI is used within climate change systems. And the application in remote sensing for our case is that we have all this satellite imagery. We have all this data that's being captured from space on the state of the biosphere. But what we're using, like, these sensors, these cameras, the radar sensors, the LiDAR sensors, all this stuff, these are measuring patterns of energy. These are in watts, reflected, watts per star radian per nanometer, per square meter. Or you also have like radar backscatter coefficients and decibels, like all this really weird abstract stuff. But one of the key things that we're interested in as ecologists and in trying to come up with, land-based climate solutions is to convert this energy information into units of like ecology, like how tall the trees are, how much carbon they store, how much they burn over time. And using some of these deep learning approaches is a great way to make that data conversion from one set of units to another, to give us like a broader perspective on the state of like how many trees burned, how fast did it occur, like where do you have defensible space problems. Like there's so many different ways that we can just do that simple conversion. Like we have all of the technical information that we need to be able to evaluate this, but putting it together in a smart sort of systems fashion is where I think there's a really great opportunity for AI to address that, just to give us the straight numbers on, what's at risk, how much carbon is there, and what do we need to do to change.
Yeah, to give a different perspective, an additional perspective on that question. So a lot of the energy systems models that we use when doing this kind of macro modeling are just really large and slow and really difficult to run. And what that means is that you often can't run a lot of the scenarios that you would like to run in order to sort of understand what various possibilities are for the energy system. And so machine learning can be used in a couple of different ways to help with that. A big one is basically the reason these models are slow to run is because they have there's a whole body of optimization theory behind this, but basically they have all of these different constraints that all have to be satisfied in order to sort of satisfy the physics of the system that you're dealing with. And there have been a lot of machine learning approaches to try to understand, for example, which of those constraints are likely to be actually, relevant at any given time. And then you can sort of take away those constraints and then run a kind of cheaper model that's likely to give you a good answer. So there are a lot of different opportunities like that where I would say the important thing is that it's not sort of an either or between existing models and new models. I think I hear a lot of people say, we have a lot of data. Why don't we just throw all of that data into a machine learning model and then we're going to get some kind of answer about what our energy system is going to look like. And I think throwing away our existing knowledge about how these systems work is not necessarily the best thing to do. But instead, if you can figure out ways to sort of bridge data-driven approaches that allows us to both use the data that we have coming in and also leverage the insights we already have from these existing models, and that's going to be like a really good route going forward.
Yeah, I think Priya hit the nail on the head on that one. Like we, for us especially, we obviously build, these models, and we have as much data as we could ever want on all these different storage solutions and energy products, and how they would be used and whatnot. But that's just one piece of it. That's one aspect of it. Building these models and getting all this data is just, kind of like the scratch on the surface. And then I also think building products is actually a fairly easy thing to do. Like engineering talent is there. Like Chris was saying, we have the technical know-how to do a lot of these things. We have the data. It's just like being smart about how to use it and implementing it in the right way. And to me, it's always really just about creating a solution that actually meets the needs of people, because you can build these crazy, complex, awesome energy storage, products that maybe our model said this is what we need to do and whatnot, but then nobody buys it and nobody uses it. So where did we go? What did we actually accomplish? Not much. And so really, user feedback is a huge thing. Actually solving problems that people want you to solve is a big thing. And really knowing how to use the data, knowing how to use these models to predict what the product you actually need to build is a very, very hard part. And that's, I think, the hard part that is needing more focus on, not how do we build products and not how do we get data in these, but how do we actually use it in a way that impacts something.
Great. I think that those are great insights into how you can use these systems and actually put it into use data-driven approaches to actually put them into real systems. So the next question is for Priya and Chad. So carbon pricing is a very important policy to encourage transition to carbon emission reduction and encourage investment into clean tech companies. What needs to be done to facilitate passing the policy, getting the policy on the ballot, and how can students help support that?
Yeah, I'm gonna give a slightly multi-part answer to that. So carbon pricing is awesome. I think there is a lot of literature on actually how it is not necessarily going to be the end all be all with respect to climate change in particular. A lot of work on how carbon pricing solutions basically encourage what are called marginal approaches to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but don't necessarily drive larger infrastructural approaches. So just a minor point to keep in mind that in addition to pushing for a carbon price, basically there are many, many other things to be pushing for that sort of incentivize larger structural changes. And in terms of sort of how to get carbon pricing on the ballot, honestly, calling your representatives, huge thing to do, often very effective. And a lot of universities additionally have programs where the universities will, for example, send students to advocate for various policies, to DC or something like that. So getting plugged into those, and even when it's possible, again, having those face-to-face meetings to these kinds of programs is definitely one way to do it. But just calling representatives is huge. And I'll sort of add that another big challenge with carbon pricing schemes often is that in particular cap and trade depends on having a really good estimate of what the emissions on the power or what the global emissions are right now, who is emitting them, and sort of how much we want each entity to reduce. When the European cap and trade market was set up, for example, they set sort of the total budget on how much greenhouse gas emissions could be emitted way too high, and that sort of tanked the prices of carbon allowances in that market and caused it to be less effective. So one way that, in addition to sort of the policy things, which are really, really important, for example, calling representatives, one way that machine learning can actually help here is by helping create more accurate greenhouse gas inventories in order to then help inform the ways in which we actually create carbon markets. And there's an alliance of nonprofit organizations called Climate Trace that's working on this. And I think they're always looking for more volunteers. So if that area is something you're interested in, I encourage you to check them out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a great answer. And I just want to reiterate that it's actually pretty hard to set the right price of carbon, because basically what you're doing is you're trying to set a price that will induce a response by private industry. And if you price it too high or too low, you won't actually hit the kind of target that you want. So I think that the US considered a carbon tax maybe back in 2010, and it got voted down. And I don't really know if it's been on the ballot again since then. So I can't really speak to that from a political standpoint. But certainly there are some goals laid out in like the Green New Deal that would address something like reducing carbon. But I'm not sure what the instrument is, if it's a tax or cap and trade. Maybe someone else knows better about that. But yeah, great question.
Oh, awesome. So now we'll move to audience questions. How can someone with a background in social sciences and non-STEM fields make an impact? What are interesting problems in the field? Anyone want to take this question?
That sounds like it's probably either me or June on that one.
Yeah, I think.
Well, I mean, I think that yeah. So I think from a social science perspective, what we can really offer is, I think, helping come up with some really interesting questions, and not only that, but sort of guiding this other type of research that's going on, especially in kind of this machine learning approach. That, you know, if you kind of start out with an uninteresting question, then you're probably going to get an uninteresting answer that is not going to be particularly useful for addressing something like climate change. So I think along the stage of doing something like AI or machine learning, there needs to be a kind of like a human in the loop, and that human, I suggest, would be a social scientist that can maybe think about, okay, this is the results that we're getting. You know, is this something that we could expect, you know, policymakers to act on, or people, you know, to want to purchase, if it's in the case of like solar panels or battery storage, or, you know, what kind of levers can be applied that would sort of induce the behavioral change that would be, you know, helpful for, you know, climate change overall. So yeah, so I think that there definitely is a place for social science. And I see that place as really kind of augmenting the role of all the great work that the other people on the panel are doing. Yeah.
Great.
Could I jump in with one?
Absolutely.
I think, or James, were you
Please
about
do.
to jump in?
I wanted to make a quick comment. I think for one thing that I've noticed is that you know, there's a really large emphasis on technology in entrepreneurship, but I think it's in many ways overemphasized. There's a lot of startup teams out there who need non-technical people to contribute to their project. There's a lot more to starting a business than just writing code and building drones. And I think if you want to contribute, there's a lot of opportunity. You just need to find other like-minded people who have different skills, maybe have the technology skills to do some implementation and integrate with their team, because they need your help. There's way too many companies out there that startups that kind of basically fall on their faces because it's just only technology people, and they have, you know, people that do tech have their own perspective, but they need help from people that don't write code or build things. So get out there and do some networking and build a team with people that do.
Yeah, and I really want to double down on that. I'm going to say it as strongly as every single climate change problem is a social science problem. So like, if you're if you're creating a forecasting model for solar power that you want a power system operator to use, right? There's so many steps there, right, that come with, you know, how do you integrate that into existing processes for power system optimization, which are often done by human operators, for example. If you're starting to look at questions of climate justice, how, for example, pollution from coal plants impacts different communities in the US, for example, differently, then you start to need, you know, critical race theory, for example, to understand that, in addition to sort of macro modeling to then understand the impacts on the energy system. A lot of the things that we've talked about are enabled by markets. Economists figure out how markets work. So many different things like that. So yeah, I would agree. I think technology is often really overemphasized, but it's only ever going to be one piece of the puzzle. Whether it is you're working on a specific problem, there's probably a social science aspect to it, or in order for a particular solution to succeed, there's often a policy question or a market question underneath that, which is like, how do I actually enable this kind of landscape of solutions to actually come to fruition? And that also ends up being social science and policy. So I think there's a lot you can do coming from those backgrounds.
Essentially, what you're saying is you can't think about climate change solutions if you're not thinking about policy, people, or money. Technology is kind of just helping facilitate that. That's awesome.
Absolutely.
Anyone else want to chime in on that question, or we can move on? Great answers, by the way. Great. So there are people who are financially dependent on the fossil fuels economy. And if we transition to clean energy, they're obviously going to lose their jobs, their livelihoods. How can we mitigate their fears? This question, I think it makes sense for Chad to take a jab at it, and perhaps anyone else.
Well, so I don't have a really good answer for that. I mean, I think that there's certainly a role for government to provide investment into clean energy and help transition people who maybe were in the fossil fuel industry into other jobs that are related to maybe clean energy development. So, I mentioned before, there's a lot of jobs now in unconventional oil and gas development, which is also known as fracking. Maybe people who work in those types of jobs can be transitioned into, installing solar panels or, installing wind farms, like this kind of transition, I think. But I mean, I think we also can't sugarcoat it and say that there aren't going to be winners and losers, because I think that there likely will be winners and losers. And to portray it as a situation where, there's going to be this easy transition to a green economy and, everybody's going to be better off is likely not true for a lot of people that live in these fossil fuel resource dependent areas. And so I think it's really the role of government and maybe kind of society overall to think about, okay, if we want a clean energy future, how can we go about supporting the people that are not going to be able to have these jobs in the short term?
Awesome. Okay, and so the next question is, in terms of, in the context of business and entrepreneurship, how do you transition from having ideas about ventures to actually collaborating with others in a concrete fashion, obviously in the context of climate change solutions?
I can answer that. I think you really need to get out there and do some networking, and really reach out to people. And I'd say the pandemic environment is obviously has all sorts of impacts, but one opportunity that it has opened up is that virtual meetings are the new in-person meeting. So you can actually meet with people all over the world, and a virtual meeting is kind of, in many cases, the only way to do it. So people are, I think, more open to that type of reaching out. But in terms of getting into entrepreneurship, I think getting engaged with local entrepreneurship communities, like pitch competitions, entrepreneurship clubs. I mean, you really just need to network and get out there. I do think that learning how to pitch your business is really important. And I think even if you don't have a great business idea, coming up with an idea and going through the exercise of pitching it, either maybe to investors or just to people interested in your business, even if it's family members. But learning how to pitch a business quickly and efficiently really kind of opens the gateway for you to start thinking about things from a business standpoint and really distilling your ideas down into business ideas. And that's an exercise that I think everyone should go through if you're going to want to be involved with entrepreneurship, even if you're not going to be the CEO of the company who necessarily pitches it to real investors. It's an exercise that I think is really, really useful. Kind of helps you clarify your ideas and really get down to the fundamental core of them.
In building the Forest Observatory, we sort of approached this issue through co-designing the whole system. And what I mean by that was, at the beginning of the process, we interviewed about 70 people who came from a broad width of, or broad span of different organizations who work in the field of wildfire. And part of that was so that we could better understand the problem and just do a lot of listening. It took us about 3 months to actually just get a sense for what the field was like. but also it gave us a better sense of connection with a lot of the actual key players within the field. And by the time we were done listening to all the feedback, we were able to then, build the product that addressed the needs that they specifically had. And we were able to return to them afterwards and say, here, thank you for your feedback. Here's how we implemented it in the product that we build. And here's how it addresses the needs that you stated previously. And so in that way, the networking was really valuable for us, the feedback and making sure that we were actually building something that was useful to people, and the ability to actually follow through and feel like there was some ownership on their part for what we had built, I think was a pretty key step there. So just integration with the broader community and co-design was really important for us.
Great. There's a lot of solutions to kind of climate changes and a lot of approaches to it. I guess not solutions, but a lot of approaches to helping solve the problem. What are perhaps the low-hanging fruit, or in the short term, what are short-term solutions that we can get working on right now to see kind of impacts in the short term? This question would be for Priya, Chris, and Chad.
Our approach is to start more good fires and to stop most of the bad ones. And so by good fires, I mean ones that we're sort of planning and doing a lot of prescribed cultural fire. And as by controlling when you're applying the fires and where you're applying them, you tend to reduce the risk that it gets out of control and becomes a catastrophic wildfire. And this tends to have really positive effects because the areas burn at lower intensity, so you have less harmful smog. They reduce the total emissions from a wildfire, and they have just lower human health impacts. And they're also effective for ecological regeneration across these areas. Bad fires tend to be things that are started by utilities, fires that start in close to communities, and ones that don't have, that burn at really high intensity. Wildfire is one of the largest carbon emission sources for the state. I suspect it's going to be the largest for the state this year. And insofar as we can reduce the number of catastrophic wildfires that we have and start more fires, that's a really difficult task. We need to just be scaling that effect so much more effectively. But coming up with ways to do better ecological management and restoration is going to require a huge workforce of people that currently are untrained in doing so. So finding ways to engage with the environment around your space and figure out where and how to do prescribed burns, not only on federal properties, but also on private lands, is one opportunity that I think, my general perspective is we should be getting into sort of large scale gardening. We should all be tending to the garden of the environment around us. And I think it's not immediately clear how exactly we're going to do this. We don't want to just have everyone go out and start fires in the forest and hope that it works out. But maybe something close to that is, what we're edging towards. So that's maybe not a literal answer that everyone can go out and do tomorrow, but we need to start doing it probably tomorrow.
I would say one is definitely insulate your building, get your friends to insulate their buildings, get your workplace to insulate their buildings. It's, again, one of those really, really unsexy things, but it's easy to do and can be potentially quite impactful.
Yeah, I mean, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, call your policymakers. I think it's something that you can make a routine of doing to sort of support various climate change relevant policies, et cetera. And while the overall effect of that is longer term, it's something that you taking a short-term action and again, getting your friends to take these short-term actions can really build up and have an impact over time.
Yes, and that was a variation of my answer, so good.
Sorry, Jen.
Good, yeah, perfect.
Great. And I think one more question. So electric vehicles have captivated a lot of people in the way they address climate change. What are ways to commodify or commercialize sustainable technologies? Michael and James, do you have any insight on this?
Can you actually repeat the question, bro?
Yes, sure. So electric vehicles have captivated a lot of people in the way that they address climate change. What are ways to commodify or commercialize sustainable technologies?
I think Priya actually talked about this a little bit with just the whole autonomy space and how we don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing to have autonomous EVs. I would obviously wager on the side of it being a good thing because, like she said, most of the autonomous side vehicles are typically EV, and with with autonomy, if you think of Uber and Lyft and that kind of thing, I think the end goal for people really is to just like fix transportation as a whole. I think everyone having a car in general is a terrible thing. We don't need that. Like getting from point A to point B somehow is way more difficult than it should be. Our public transportation systems are pretty terrible, and like one of the easiest things that we can do right now, I shouldn't say easiest because it's a really hard problem, but one of the things we're actively working on is the autonomous EV space, getting that making that extremely affordable and commoditizing that for people to use that as their new transportation or public transportation system is like a huge impact I think that we can make. If you can reduce the amount of cars in general on the road, that's huge. We've seen governments try to build out better and better public transportation systems. Other countries have done it. For some reason, our country isn't able to do it very well. And if we can somehow offset that to the private market by getting autonomous EVs to start taking its places, I think that's a huge win. And one way that we can do this.
One thing I wanted to add is that actually the Tesla model, which I'm a big believer in Tesla, was to build a better product. Don't just build a sustainable product. Build a better car, and sell a product to people that was just simply better than the existing solution, and also is sustainable. I think there's people tend to think, who maybe aren't that interested in sustainability and the climate change, that they don't want these new technologies because they have to give something up. If you can find opportunities where, in fact, you're not giving something up, you're actually getting something that's better, that's also sustainable. That's really when you really see some serious amplification, which I think is happening now in the EV world. Electric cars are simply better cars. They're faster, they're more convenient, they're less polluting, and they also happen to be better for the environment and use renewable energy sources. So it's simply an area where the technology has enabled the win-win for consumers. And if you can find that same convergence for any customer, that's where you're really going to see the real amplification and acceleration. Because everyone, I think, sustainability and climate change, ecologically beneficial technologies appeal to people generally. But if you can find something that has both, that's also an appealing and better product, you'll see the uptake just faster. And businesses tend to be, I don't know, depending on whether you're targeting businesses or consumers, the aspects to which you pitch that vary a lot. Consumers, it's just conventional consumer marketing. There's a lot of different opinions, and they have their own feelings on such things. Businesses tend to be a little more dollars and cents wise, but ultimately the same. You're still targeting the same people, so the same factors influenced purchase decisions of businesses too. But I'll say, just generally, if you can find a product opportunity where you're simply making a better product for your customers that's also sustainable, you can have the win-win.
Yeah, just one final point on that, because that's such an important thing, James. I think it expands more than just the EV space. I know the question was targeted towards EV, but like Priya was saying, just insulation is one thing that you can do that's extremely valuable. I mean, you can take things like that don't sound sexy and make them sexy for people, and people will buy them. If there's something that is so obviously better for the consumer, they will purchase, they will buy that. Take Nest kind of tried to solve a little bit on our time of use with air conditioning, which is a huge impact to our grid, has a huge impact to our grid. And if we could minimize that usage, that's a huge thing right there. And this is a little $100 device. So making things that are easy for people to purchase, that are improvements to people's lives, that also have an impact on the environment, it may not sound sexy at first, but they're very reasonable. Like they're very achievable things that we can do that I think we'll see a lot of going forward.
Great. This has been an absolute joy. I appreciate all the perspectives. We touched on machine learning, policy, entrepreneurship, business, and all across the spectrum. So thank you everyone for coming today. And thank you to all the panelists for your time. We can end it there.
Yeah, thanks for organizing this.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Bill.
Yeah.
That
Yeah,
was awesome.
thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Have a good rest of your day.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.